Good afternoon. My name is Bill Shambra, and I'm director of Hudson Institute's Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal. Kristen McIntyre and I welcome you to today's discussion of a new book written by Georgia Levenson Keohane entitled Social Entrepreneurship for the 21st Century. As difficult as it is to pronounce entrepreneurship, the Keohane is in fact the correct pronunciation of that last name, even though it's spelled quite differently. And I'm sure I'll only mispronounce it about 3 times in the course of this discussion. It's a particular honor to co-sponsor today's panel with the Roosevelt Institute, where Ms. Keohane is a fellow, and thank you, Mark Schmidt, in our front row here for helping to arrange this collaboration. Special welcome to our viewers over Ustream in the back. All the advantages of being here, except in the back of the room we have on sale the book, normally a $30 value, available now for the low price of $20. So those of you over Ustream might want to consider showing up in person in order to buy this book at this events-only price. The subtitle of Ms. Keohane's book is Innovation Across the Nonprofit, Private, and Public Sectors, for this is indeed a comprehensive look at social entrepreneurship in its many forms across all sectors, and so is an excellent introduction to the concept. The subtitle also, however, alerts us to something of a progression or an ascent even that the volume makes. For it begins with social entrepreneurship's origins in the 90s within a nonprofit sector that was deeply skeptical, she says, about government's ability to solve problems. It then proceeds up a path that seeks to incorporate marketplace principles into social entrepreneurship. And finally, the book describes a present and points us toward a future in which the public sector or government is no longer an object of suspicion by social entrepreneurs as it was originally, but is now rather trusted, as we read on the book's final page, to be a, quote, market shaper steering private capital profitably and responsibly to public purpose. Speaking directly to today's political condition, Ms. Keohane suggests that this would help us, quote, transcend the paralytic states versus markets ideological rift and affirm that collaboration between government and business is necessary for entrepreneurship, social and otherwise. This proposition is not without controversy, as I suspect we shall soon find out, as we explore the volume's fulsome account of social entrepreneurship with our superbly qualified panel. We'll get underway with Ms. Keohane's account of her work, followed by comments by Diana Wells, who's currently president of Ashoka, one of the pioneering organizations in this field of social entrepreneurship. Then we'll hear from Howard Husick, vice president for research at Manhattan Institute and director of its Social Entrepreneur Initiative, where I am proud and honored to serve on their selection panel for the initiative's annual award winners. And finally, Rick Cohen will wrap things up with his views as a national correspondent for Nonprofit Quarterly Magazine. I should add that Paul Light cannot be with us this morning as originally scheduled, since he's neck deep in the academic politics of New York University, and this week apparently turned out to be unexpectedly busy for him. So for all of you Paul Light junkies who came here today just to see him, we'll give you a moment to file quietly out of the room. Okay, no one is filing out. That's good. So let's get things underway. Ms. Keohane.
Terrific.
You can either speak from there or come up here. Either one, whichever you prefer.
So thank you, Bill, very much, and the folks at the Hudson Institute. I appreciate tremendously the chance to talk about my work and about the book, and thank you to Mark Schmidt from the Roosevelt Institute for introducing me to Bill and arranging this, and to the other folks, my other colleagues at Roosevelt who made this project possible. I have to say, it's just a huge honor and privilege today to be able to discuss a book about social entrepreneurship with this kind of panel. Diana and Howard and Rick in various ways are not only great practitioners and scholars, of the field of social entrepreneurship and know a lot more about it and have been working veterans in the field for a lot longer than I, but also really, I think, understand in a deep and meaningful way how social entrepreneurship in the nonprofit sector more broadly fit into a larger discussion of states, of markets, of commercial and capital players, and in particular how we think about the respective role of all of these actors in these fields working together to try to advance social change. So I have to say that there are a number of books that have been written about the good work of social entrepreneurs, and the motivation, to me, to writing this book was exactly this public policy, states, markets, historical scope, sort of larger picture context. And even the breathy language on the jacket cover suggests that in some way I'm proselytizing this notion of social enterprise or impact investing, what Howard would call quasi-capitalism. And I explore some of that in the book, but I think that really I was interested in the scope, the context, the larger picture, and many of the debates and the tensions I think that arise with cross-sector work. And I think that we'll get into some of those debates today. That said, I stand by the assertion that I do think over the course of the generation, plus or minus, we have seen a really tectonic, significant shift in the way we think about and work towards social change. And part of the reason I think that the shift is of that kind of magnitude is because it is across sectors. We see the nonprofit sector, the private commercial sector, and the public sector. And so essentially what I try to do with the book is trace some of those changes and some of the commonalities from the nonprofit sector. I examine some of the work of social service providers, nonprofits that are doing innovative work, begin with Ashoka, but others, City or Teach for America. I dive a little more deeply into what I really think are some interesting innovations in philanthropy and the funders of sort of some of the nonprofit work. In some cases, adopting business models and market models. In the for-profit sector, I think conversely, I try to look at enterprises and investors that in fact have been infused with different notions of value and values from the social sector. And then lastly, in the public sector, I try to examine both historically and in contemporary terms a set of public policies that can look to shape markets, incent innovation, incent entrepreneurial activity in the private sphere, whether it's nonprofit or commercial actors. So I think the easiest way to actually get into some of this is to look at one or two examples, which I think try to illuminate not just the debates, but some of the more interesting places where there's sort of cross-sector collaboration and work. I think I'll give one example and then would love to open it up. I looked at a number of sort of entrenched, really vexing social problems and tried to think about whether there were people addressing them in new and different ways. So I'll give one example. The problem is the problem of light, and more specifically, light at night. So it's hard to imagine in a room illuminated like this. But we know in developing countries, one of the major problems is the problem of light at night. And about 2 billion people in countries all over the world have no adequate light sources at night. So that means that they are using candles or kerosene or single-use batteries or lanterns to cook by, to read by, to try to do homework by, to try to watch children by. Completely inadequate, often expensive, often dangerous, and often environmentally noxious sources of light. So governments have been trying to deal with this. There's clearly been market failures. There isn't a lot of profit in developing products to deal with this. And I looked at an interesting example. In 2006, the Rockefeller Foundation partnered with a company called Incentive to try to think about a number of challenges, this problem of light being one of them. Incentive had been a company that prior to its work with Rockefeller worked primarily with companies like Eli Lilly, Dow Chemical, Boeing, often large companies that were trying to solve scientific problems in-house, but their traditional R&D channels or mechanisms weren't adequate, weren't producing the solutions that they want. So they partnered with Incentive. The term sort of crowdsource was not in vogue at the time, but Incentive essentially had a community of about 80 to 100,000 scientists worldwide, and they would essentially source the problem out for a fee to their clients, and with about an 80% solve rate. So the Rockefeller Foundation said, interesting, can we apply this methodology, this sort of crowdsourcing, however we want to call it, network solution approach to a different set of entrenched social, environmental problems that we're dealing with. And we're going to use a prize to try to reward the problem solving. So they didn't just post one, they posted 10 of these challenges, the problem of light being one of them. And what happened is a set of researchers, World Bank researchers on the ground said, we actually have quasi-solved this problem of light. We have a solar light source that people are in fact are using, but doesn't fully illuminate the room. And an engineer in New Zealand actually tweaked that existing kind of flashlight. His design essentially required a different set of parts, which he sources from other engineers in China. The result is the Boga light, which is a light at low cost that can illuminate an entire room and is now used widely in Gaza, in Haiti, Latin America, Africa. And the reason I like the Boga light example is because I think it illuminates a few of these aspects of what I would call social entrepreneurship. One is that the Rockefeller Foundation had sort of become, even though it was 100 years old, one of what we might call these sort of new venture philanthropies. And we all sort of know what that means. We're familiar with the terms, the jargon. Program areas became portfolios, grants become investments. How we think about social impact is measured as return on investment or social return on investment. But it wasn't just this language. In fact, some of these new philanthropies, whether it was Rockefeller or some of the newer ones, Gates or Midyar, Robin Hood in New York, were trying out new tools. And the prize was an interesting kind of tool. Now, prizes are not new. Prizes have been used by governments, universities, private sector companies, monarchies for centuries, and some of the most famous date probably to the 18th and 19th centuries. But at the end of the 20th century in the U.S., government use of prizes has sort of tailed off as patents became a more effective or sometimes more prolific sort of economic incentive tool. But in the philanthropic sector over the last 20, 25 years, there's been an explosion of use of philanthropic prizes, hundreds of millions of dollars in new prizes. In the last 10 years, probably $60 million in new prizes. And it's not just philanthropy. So the incentive Rockefeller example, in fact, was preceded by places, actually Ashoka is one of the very few, but Ashoka's Changemaker put together a similar sort of open source prize example. And we've just read, the MacArthur Foundation announced a prize last week, and there's this new breakthrough life science prize. The prizes, there's sort of prize mania and prize fervor. But the question is, why are the new philanthropists, why are these new sort of social entrepreneur types like prizes? And to me, that was an interesting question. And the reason is that prizes, in some cases, either simulate or stimulate markets when markets have failed. So what we mean by that is essentially three things. One, they're pay for success. So unlike a grant, which is you sort of say, here's your check, good luck, we'll all keep our fingers crossed, prizes are only awarded to effective, proven solutions. So two, there's an evidence base. There's proof of concept. And so in this case, the Boga light, we knew it worked. I think if there's one hallmark across the sectors, nonprofit, private, public, of this sort of social entrepreneurship sweep, it has to do with this laser-like focus on measurement and evaluation, proof of efficacy. And I think we will get to this today. I think this is a huge and fraught and interesting conversation about the value and the limitations of measurement and evaluation. And I think some of the unintended consequences of sort of a relentless focus on really quantifying a lot of these things. But nevertheless, this is a hallmark, I think, of the social entrepreneurship movement. I think third and finally, there's this issue of leverage. So the idea is that you have a prize, and the prize simulates or stimulates a lot of activity, a lot of innovation, some invention that far exceeds the cash value of the prize. So in the case of Boga light, far exceeded $40,000. The X prizes, which are 10 million, are stimulating millions, in some cases billions of dollars in activity. The reason that I became interested in the philanthropic prize sort of explosion is because I think that these uses of prizes in the philanthropic sector, places like Ashoka, really reignited in government an interest in new tools like prizes. So in 2008, when the Obama administration came in, they invited in the incentives and the Ashokas and the Rockefellers and the X prizes to sort of say, help us think through a little bit whether we can apply this methodology, this tool, to a new set of social environmental challenges. So not just at agencies like the Defense Department or NASA or places that have traditionally used prizes or tournaments or that kind of competitive granting to incent technological breakthrough, but can we apply this prize method to harder to define and harder to measure social challenges? So can we think about the achievement gap and whether a prize is relevant? Can we think about diabetes or asthma or obesity or health problems that disproportionately affect poor families and poor communities. Can we think about a prize there? And what we've started to see is a sort of some new policies and approaches to granting that tend to look a little bit more like prizes, whether it's Race to the Top, or whether it's the innovation funds that have come out of a couple of the federal agencies, or whether it's, if you go on challenges.gov, you will see a pretty broad suite of new program areas that have been designed around the prize methodology. Now, I will stop there, except to say I think this is pretty cool. I think it's cool because I think it's an interesting example of a methodology or approach sort of porting itself from one sector to another. I also think that in the best case, especially some of these crowdsourced open source approach to prizes, really draw on players from across the sectors. I will say, and we will open this up, don't think this is a panacea by any stretch. I think it's an interesting experiment, and I think there are clearly many types of social and environmental problems that do not lend themselves, whether because they can't be measured, they're over a large time horizon, however you want to define it, that don't lend themselves. But I do think that some of these experiments do exemplify well the sort of social entrepreneurship movement. So I will leave it at that, but love to come back to some of this. Thanks.
So I will. I have to say I loved the book, having spent some years in each of the last 4 decades involved with Ashoka and social entrepreneurship. It was just a wonderful collection of the whole panorama. Just the way that Georgia has pulled together so many different components. Instead of looking at individual social entrepreneurs or simply the movement, it's really a portrayal of the ecosystem and the development of an ecosystem and the forces that have played out here. And I think it's a wonderful portrayal of that ecosystem development. I'll spend a few minutes talking about how that portrayal measures against Ashoka's arc of what we've seen and what our experience with the ecosystem development has been. So for the first 20 years as Ashoka began looking for social entrepreneurs and developing the credibility of this kind of impact on social change through the impact that individual social entrepreneurs, this identity, really spending 20 years looking for these people, building that identity, that credibility, as drivers of social change through a social entrepreneur. And looking for examples around the world to make the case that these people and this driver of change exists. At the same time, we began to see the larger impact beyond that individual's intervention. So if Jill Violette has an intervention to change the way children grow up by using the entry point of recess, we know she's having impact on recess, on the school system. She has amazing evidence-based data on how that is how an intervention at recess transforms discipline, teamwork, engagement in the classroom, etc. That impact is there. Over time and over a pattern, as we've elected and found and tracked more and more social entrepreneurs, we also see and have come to see that that impact is one piece, but the broader impact is that social entrepreneurs' impact on the people around them. Those in their movement, those in their institution, and enabling those individuals interacting with that social entrepreneur to recognize A, that change is possible, and B, that many more people have a role to play. And that's what brought us to our redefined mission of democratizing social change and change making through what we now call our Everyone a Change Maker mission. So our work, which started as an organization, a move, and then by the 90s we were talking about a movement, as many others were taking up the terminology and recognize the change that individuals have, to recognizing that there's a team of teams moving from an institution base to how do you spark a group of people coming from different perspectives to drive change. That they're, and again, this is from the work that we were tracking of our social entrepreneurs who, in our customer sort of feedback surveys, recognize that the early support and recognition, the living stipend, which we offered in those and still offer, so that the social entrepreneurs freed up and can work full time on their idea, that over time, the deeper value was recognizing how their individual intervention fit into a broader whole or a broader landscape of people affecting change within the Ashoka network, and surfaced opportunities to collaborate across fields or within a field or within a school system to drive a bigger change, which may have policy impact. So the problem solvers of today, those social entrepreneurs and their impact beyond the individual change they are driving, is this enabling others to give themselves permission to be change makers and to make change. So we now, while social entrepreneurs remain core to everything Ashoka does and everything we know and learn about social change, we're working across a broader spectrum of both of innovation phase within elementary schools and young people, within high schools with teenagers, as well as other segments of society like universities and corporations, ensuring that they recognize and see a role that they can play in social change. Within the backdrop of the economic crisis, one of the big shifts that I saw and have seen is how people began to recognize that the social entrepreneur, even in the not-for-profit sector, or citizen sector, as we like to call it at Ashoka, are economic drivers as well. And that conversation appeared for me and finally in 08, 09, as we began to see that and recognize that, based on Lester Solomon's work, the growth, the one area of job growth in 08, 09, and 10 was in the not-for-profit sector, and that social entrepreneurs, like their business counterparts, are creating jobs and institutions that employ people, and at the same time, they're solving social issues. So that economic argument and link has been one way that the government and government policy has been brought in and connected with the movement. Similarly, in the context of the economic crisis, corporations engage and have begun to engage with us in ways that we had been talking about for years and years before, but there was a much deeper appetite that went well beyond corporate social responsibility, coming from corporate leadership directly, seeing that their bottom line and business would benefit from engagement with social entrepreneurs. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A. But that relationship with the corporate world being a huge area for more impact and for the growth and scale of both individual social entrepreneurs' impact and collective impact movement more broadly. Stop there.
this okay? Am I being heard okay? Great. First of all, congratulations to Georgia on the publication of this very thorough and useful book. And we agree on a number of things. We agree that there's a new generation of idealistic people who think of themselves as change makers, that Ashoka, among others, has encouraged them to come forward, and that new arrangements in approaching our social welfare problems as a society are very much needed. I've thought of, in my work at the Manhattan Institute, of social entrepreneurs not necessarily as a challenge to the welfare state, but at least in parallel to the welfare state. And with that in mind, I do have some concerns about the idea that Bill outlined in his introductory remarks of government playing a leadership role, and that Diana hinted at just now. So I'll address that in my remarks. Earlier this week in the New York Times, the Nobel laureate at Columbia University economist Edmund Phelps reflected on the limits of government-led policy in the private economic sphere. He wrote, "The difficulty with national industrial policy is that it places those decisions in the hands of government officials who are remote from the local expertise and insights that companies draw on for dynamic innovation. It's hard enough for venture capitalists and early-stage investors to make the right choices. It's unimaginable," he asserted, "for government to do that well." And he feared that they may be guided, that is, public officials, by what's best for their political prospects, rather than what they might agree was best if they were not directly involved. So in discussing the idea of government leadership in the nonprofit citizen sector, I'll take that term, I'll argue that there's ample reason to believe that similar flaws characterize government initiative aimed at both directing social entrepreneurs and using government appropriations to scale up private nonprofit social programs judged to show promise. And I'll argue further that effective approaches to social services and human development efforts aimed at assisting and uplifting the disadvantaged can occur outside a government-led scaling process, and that the assumption that scaling, getting bigger and reaching more people, requires government should not be taken as a given. So that's two big things I'm going to try to support. It's important first to realize, I think, that the idea of a government-led nonprofit social entrepreneurship partnership is really not a new one, and that it has a track record that should spark some concerns. Prior to the 1960s, nonprofit groups, innovative or not, some of them were, had little involvement with government. Well, that changed with the advent of the Great Society and the war on poverty to one of mutual dependence. This effort at government-led social service innovation completely reshaped the nonprofit and philanthropic landscape. The federal government today makes use of upwards of 900 grant programs, often directed to other arms of government, state, city, county, which in turn contract with nonprofits. That helps them create jobs, including some of which have been established in direct response to government's initiative. Everything from early childhood education, groups formed in order to get Head Start money, for instance, supported housing for the homeless, Meals on Wheels for the elderly, all stages of life. As a result, government spending on such social services has come to surpass private giving, even though it often goes to the same groups that private donors support. Giving USA reports that some $26 billion, for instance, of private charitable giving annually goes to human services organizations. By comparison, the Urban Institute has estimated that human services nonprofits received, as of 2009, $100 billion in grants and contracts. That amounts to 65% of their total revenue. This has been government-led social entrepreneurship of a kind, and the results have not generally affirmed the utility of this approach, as the economist Edmund Phelps might lead us to believe. For instance, one of the most widespread of such public-private social service programs, the preschool program for disadvantaged students, Head Start, is provided at a cost of $8 billion annually in all 50 states by nonprofit, citizen-led groups, which can draw on both public and private monies. Yet study after study has shown disappointing results. January 2010, federal HHS study found that all the benefits of Head Start had faded out by the end of the first grade. It's a little bit better December 2012 study. They lasted approximately till the third grade before really disappearing in any measurable way at all. Isabel Sawhill of the Brookings Institution, John Barron of the Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy, speaking of measurement, noted it's the 10th time since 1990 that gold standard evaluation methods have been used to evaluate federal programs, and 9 of those evaluations found weak or 0 positive results. Now, this is not to say that some good has not come from this government-citizen sector partnership. Indeed, the argument can be made that there is inherent value, moral value, in simply providing the services regardless of the results, and that there are things that happen that we really can't measure. And there's no doubt that government has a core role to play in safety net provision, writing checks through Social Security. Government does it very well. Whether you think that's the best approach to redistribution or not, we know that the government does it efficiently. But a similar emphasis, one cannot conclude that philanthropy should broadly be directed in its role by government based on this evidence. A similar emphasis on reaching as many Americans as possible is embodied in one of the programs that Georgia referred to, the Social Innovation Fund, an interesting new initiative of the Obama administration through which private donors are explicitly asked to provide matching funds for federal grants to social entrepreneurs, selected on the basis of priorities set by the Corporation for National and Community Service. The fund is intended to bring public and private funding together to align them in the jargon to test which should be scaled up in further jargon. But less than 4 years since the fund's establishment, there's reason to be concerned about the political dimensions which concerns Professor Phelps about government-led initiatives. Rather than focusing, as was thought, on a small group of innovative programs and rigorously evaluating them, the fund, through its private foundation partners, has distributed federal funds to more than 130 so-called sub-grantees in 33 states and 100 cities. It's hard to imagine that rigorous analysis is going on of all of those groups, and that this is really altogether distinct from the dreaded earmarks which Congress has allegedly banished. Put broadly, the idea of government leading philanthropy and social entrepreneurship has been tried and poses concerns. So too does another idea referenced in George's book, that government should create new legal frameworks, such as the B or benefit corporation, intended to lay the groundwork for so-called hybrid organizations which will combine social mission with the profit motive. As I write in the current issue of National Affairs, in the essay Georgia was very kind enough to refer to, such an approach assumes that firms which do not set out self-consciously to do good only benefit their own owners and managers. The worry here is not that business might be regulated. Business to thrive needs regulation, but the potential is there to allow firms to hide inefficiency behind service to a good cause. Recall that we've already seen models of regulation-driven capital allocation based on the kind of social justice criteria embedded in a B corporation, and they're cause for concern. The Community Reinvestment Act and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac may not have been, and I don't think they were, the only precipitating causes of the housing crash, but when Fannie Mae is the largest purchaser in the secondary market of mortgages, one has to be concerned that because their emphasis was on volume of mortgages rather than quality of mortgages, and that's a characteristic one would expect from a government program, they certainly played a part in the Great Recession. That's government-led social entrepreneurship, if you will. Being assessed on non-financial criteria tends to moot the price signals that not only drive efficiency but serves to allocate capital broadly. But my concerns go beyond the ineffectiveness of government finance at nonprofits and a concern that there's a lack of appreciation on the part of those who would see government as playing the leadership role in both for-profit product development and nonprofit social services for the social good which traditional business can create even without adopting a self-aware social purpose, and for the potential of social entrepreneurs to spread ideas broadly without aligning with government. The advent of new products and of willing buyers and willing sellers can lead to a cascade of social benefits without an overt social purpose. Consider, for instance, the 2007 analysis by University of California, Los Angeles economist Robert Jensen about the introduction of cell phones to the fishing industry in the poor Indian coastal state of Kerala. Historically, the fishermen who caught sardines there in the Arabian Sea had a conundrum. They had no way to know which of the many commercial ports their competitors had already sold their catch at. No way to know where they might get the best price. Many times they would get to port, find out there was no market for what they had, and their catch was merely thrown away and wasted. But in his paper, The Digital Provide, Jensen found that the simple introduction of cell phones, technology developed in the for-profit sector and distributed through traditional commercial channels, changed everything. Armed with mobile phones, fishermen call ahead to ports to determine who would buy their catch at the best price, increasing their income and avoiding waste of environmental resources. The Economist looked at Jensen's findings, and they found that an extra 10 mobile phones per 100 people in a typical developing country leads to an additional 0.59 percentage points of growth in GDP per person. And the Economist went on, those social benefits are not provided in spite of traditional capitalism. The profit motive is what makes them possible. Governments have to issue licenses to operators. They have to enforce the rule of law. They have to have a clear and transparent regulatory framework, but they don't have to run mobile phone businesses or commission research in mobile phones. This does not mean, I'm not saying that private markets will fill all social needs. I don't believe that. But nor does it mean that absent government signals and funding, good ideas can't be brought to scale. Consider, for instance, an example in George's book. Jane Addams, legendary founder of Hull House in Chicago, the leading immigrant assistance settlement house of its day. Not mentioned is the fact that 2 decades after its founding, there were more than 400 similar settlement houses, all individually chartered local organizations, only loosely affiliated through a trade association. Government was not involved. Good ideas can spread through local champions. And the same thing is happening today without the sort of fanfare accompanying the advent of social impact bonds and hybrid organizations. Social entrepreneurs acting on their own are finding ways to spread their ideas to significant scale. A couple of examples drawn from the ranks of the Social Entrepreneurship Award program that Bill was kind enough to refer to, and that I've helped administer since 2001 at the Manhattan Institute. Cincinnati Works, led by 2 idealistic founders, Dave and Leanne Phillips. He's a retired Big Four accountant. She wrote a book called One Couple's Mission to End Poverty in Their Community. They focus on instilling the habits and attitudes that lead to success in the workplace. Their program reports 84%, and it's audited, he is an accountant, 84% of those it's helped place in jobs since 2005 remain on the job today. That far exceeds the performance of the nonprofits funded by the Federal Workplace Investment Act, which has placed only 56% after 6 months and loses 20% of those in the 6 months following. Analogous efforts to go to scale without government are being undertaken by the Boston-based Village to Village, spreading its approach to helping the elderly age in place through support services, and Volunteers in Medicine, based in Burlington, Vermont, establishing free clinics staffed by volunteer health professionals to serve the uninsured. Both now have operations in more than 90 cities. Organizations don't necessarily even have to have branches all over the country to be influential. Consider the example of one of my favorite young philanthropists, Peter Thiel, who announced in September 2010 he'd pay a dozen young adults $100,000 each to drop out of college and pursue their own business plan. Apart from the effects on their businesses, on those people, he started a national conversation on the value of higher education. And at a time of high student debt, poor college completion rates, he changed, I would submit, the discussion of the value of college in a way that government doesn't feel it has the license to do. And in fact, the Department of Education continues to talk about, let's get as many people into colleges as we can. And Thiel is talking about, let's find the right approach to further education for everybody. Now, this is not to say, in conclusion, that I'm satisfied in the world we now live in with the effort and reach of philanthropy and social entrepreneurs. But rather than marrying these new idealists to the bureaucratic and political culture of government, I'd encourage major donors themselves to announce broad efforts aimed at specific goals, and then calling for local social entrepreneurs to come forward to help fulfill them. Why not, for instance, a national philanthropically supported but locally led effort to help all those who wish to learn English have the chance to do so? We know there's a powerful correlation between learning English and immigrants advancing up the socioeconomic ladder. Why not, speaking of pre-K education, as the president is, do the same for that and look for what Dave Phillips of Cincinnati Works calls local zealots to take up the cause and make sure they have some of their own money in the bank before they open for business. There's a great deal we should be doing to provide Americans with the tools they need to thrive in our changing and challenging economy, and government will have a role to play, as I said before, particularly in providing the financial safety net. But the record shows it would be unwise to look to government to lead either private business or private philanthropy. Thanks very much.
Well, I'm not Paul Light. I'm just here for comic relief. But I think this has been a great discussion already, and I could basically throw out everything I was going to say and basically just start taking on some of the questions that have been raised so intriguingly. I have to say, first off, that what I appreciate about the book is sort of, in a way, the flip side, Diane, of what you were talking about. You were talking about social entrepreneurship or social entrepreneurs driving policy change. And I like the book talking about what policy does to drive social entrepreneurs. So, and the question that, of course, Howard's raising is, should it be there at all, and does it actually undo, in some ways, the dynamic of social entrepreneurs? I don't even like the term social entrepreneurs, to be honest, because when I read the book, and I viewed it as a real panorama of issues and of models, it's about social innovation as much as it is social entrepreneurs. And I think that's partly one of the problems that this whole kind of dialogue has, is we focus on individual people and we forget about, I think Diana used the word ecosystem. So we forget about the ecosystem that's needed. Before coming here, since I'm a late addition to the panel, I called a friend of mine and said, I'm going to be on a panel responding to all these experts in social entrepreneurship. What do you think of that topic? And this person actually works in Gaza. So it was interesting that you gave that example. And I said, what do you think of that? And then I put the phone down as she explained what she thought in some very interesting language, talking about social entrepreneurs as people creating businesses, accessing new sources of capital, and making money, and you don't see them much at the local level. And I said, well, give me examples. And, of course, she came up with the good examples, the cook stoves in Africa and so forth. I said, well, what's the problem here? And she said, the problem is that people talk a lot about social entrepreneurship. They talk much, much more than they actually do things. So one of the reasons I like Howard here is that he has an actual program which is basically saying we're recognizing Cincinnati Works, we're recognizing people that are actually doing stuff as opposed to the people that are talking about how they write about and conceptualize it. So it's always a pleasure to hear Howard, even though sometimes we don't quite always agree. I know that my role usually is to be the liberal piñata at Hudson Institute programs, but I don't believe this is actually a liberal conservative issue in many ways. If you think about the fact that this gets these programs get support from both sides of the aisle, that the Social Innovation Fund was created by President Obama, the Promised Neighborhoods program is an Obama administration piece. You look at some of the major funders that are funders of some of the even non-governmental innovations. You find people like Eli Broad and John Doerr, who are major Democratic fundraisers and contributors. So rather than left and right, I really want to talk about the public policy dimensions of this discussion. And if I fall into the entrepreneurship language, I really mean innovation. Okay? Because you're not talking about people creating stuff all the time. You're talking about how you insert innovation into the multiple sectors, innovation in business and innovation in government, as well as what government does to incentivize innovation. So I'd like to talk about the utility of social enterprise, which I think George's book does a good job on in terms of what government can spur and incentivize. Talk about tempering, I think, the zeitgeist that basically, I think, even with your caveats that it's not a panacea, people treat it like it is a panacea. And I think that's a very, very dangerous dynamic that's occurring in the nonprofit sector and in government. And then watching out, I believe, through both public and private activity for the hucksters who I think will ride this whole dynamic for what they can do as intermediaries and others to basically skim resources from the top and create instruments that may have little utility, but they get very excited during the process and make some money off of it. So I'm particularly focused on George's recommendations for the future. I do want to say, though, that within the concept of innovation, there are a lot of examples there that are really old examples. I mean, program-related investments and a variety of other things go back those many years. If you ask nonprofits, are you innovative or are you an entrepreneur? Very few people will say, nah, I'm not an entrepreneur. I don't do that kind of stuff. I mean, I saw a study in the UK, which they surveyed charities in the United Kingdom, and 45% of them said they were social entrepreneurs. So by self-identity, of course, you want to be entrepreneurial. It's a behavioral mode and mindset. Who wouldn't want to be identified that way? In fact, if you think about most nonprofits that I work with, and I work at sort of at the bottom of the pyramid kind of nonprofits, for them to even survive and do what they do, many times they're the best entrepreneurs I know of in the country because they survive on limited resources, on asset bases that are non-existent, on fund balances that if you take a deep breath at, you can blow them over. That's innovation in terms of just being able to survive. And given the current times and the zeitgeist, nonprofits know when you apply to a foundation for a grant, if you stick in the word entrepreneurial, that's a lot better than not sticking it in. So I'd like to, there's a dynamic here that to think of this small group of entrepreneurs. There are many entrepreneurs out there. The question is, how do you provide them the kind of support and incentivizing structures that bring out their roles? And I think that's the first element that I'd like to say is that, no offense to my colleagues in philanthropy, there's a lot of reliance on foundations. About the Social Innovation Fund, using foundations, you describe them as matching grants. I saw them as re-grant makers. And no offense to foundations, and I'm sure there are many of them in the room, and you won't be surprised to hear me say this. I haven't found foundations to be quite so focused on innovation as one might think. I haven't found foundations to be quite so market responsive as I think they probably are the least market responsive sector in our society. So that to rely on foundations in a public policy setting to be the selectors or the re-grant makers of innovators is, to me, a path that is really fraught with problems. And I think that shows even in the Social Innovation Fund that when you look at some of the choices that were made there, many of these grantees were their existing grantees. They weren't, you said, are they doing rigorous evaluations of these innovations? I question, were they looking for innovations or looking for tried and true nonprofits that they can basically say, here's basically what we're getting out of this, as opposed to let's take a flying leap and try something new and different and creative and scary and to see whether or not there's a real innovation to be involved. So that the natural reluctance of foundations to take risk really showed through. Even if you look at the instruments foundations have for this, think of program-related investments. I spent some years as the vice president of the local initiative support corporation. I spent my time chasing foundations to do PRIs all over the place. My biggest problem is I couldn't get them to take enough risk. I mean, the idea of a PRI, don't forget PRIs, for those who don't know, they're counted like grants for foundation payouts. Foundations get to call them qualifying distributions, much like a grant, so that you would think that as a grant they could take some risk there. They took almost no risk. It was impossible to get them to really say, let's use your PRIs in a way which really takes a gander at what you might be able to do with this kind of organization and that kind of activity. So I worry about the reliance on philanthropy linking to foundations as one of the prime generators of innovation when I don't find foundations to be hugely innovative as a sector, both by their past behavior and by their lack of external review. There's not a market for foundations. Nobody's going to basically unelect a foundation director. Nobody's going to basically say, let's take up their decisions with the Administrative Procedures Act and litigate what they've done, because there's not that kind of structure. My second concern, and this goes to a point that I think, Howard, you were raising as well, but I take it as a different way. Howard said volume rather than quality seems to be the driver of governmental involvement in these activities. I think the problem is one of innovation related to scale in general. The focus that you see when we talk about much of the social innovation and social entrepreneurship world is the focus on scalability and scaling up. In my own experience is I have two problems with that. First, I find that often scale doesn't necessarily get you innovation. Scale can get you actually less innovation. Scale can take, I think this is where Howard and I may agree actually on a key issue, is that often the innovation occurs from the community level or the ground level. For many activities, smaller scale activities are often where the innovation really occurs, and the top-down scalability leads to a commodification of services, a commodification of products, a distance between the community of users and the organizations that are providing that kind of assistance. It doesn't mean I'm saying small is always beautiful, but I do think there's a different kind of dynamic where the obsession with scaling up and scale, I think, leads us often in a direction that leads toward less innovation rather than more. My experience in LISC, for example, was that we were a network of innovators, yet our innovations, if they came from our central office, you knew they were dead. They were losers. Our best innovations came from the field. The people in our Harvard office came up with the idea of a guarantee of a secondary market for subsidized loans. Our people in Chicago came up with an idea of a low-income housing tax credit syndication process, so that the innovation often came from the field. It came from local. It didn't come from national. And the idea that we could stamp out and replicate this stuff often would actually stultify the innovation process that was occurring in the field. A third part is that, and this goes to the public policy issue, and that is that many of the social entrepreneurs are particularly entrepreneurial in their access to government programs. So that if I had to measure how you measure their entrepreneurship, I'd say let's look at how well they've done in collecting money. And for example, if I did a piece a couple of years ago where I looked at Teach for America, which had a very nice earmark, and several other grants. I looked at Citizen Schools and City Year, and I tracked their grants. Some of them earmarks, some of them basically privileged access to certain government programs. And I would say, how would I know they're innovative? Well, they've been innovative and entrepreneurial in the way they've been able to access money. And even though they are widely supported by private sources, when there was discussion early in the Obama administration about eliminating the Teach for America earmark, let me tell you what Teach for America thought about that idea. It didn't go over particularly well. So that there's a problem here with the government funding situation. Rather than necessarily always incentivizing innovation, what it often does is it becomes the product that the innovators want to use, and almost like a measure of their innovation. Even for some of the Social Innovation Fund grantees, you saw some significant issues of the people that were helping to advise the fund were also among the grantees that were then administering it or selected as re-granters. In some cases, you look at the grant recipients of AmeriCorps, which is one of the major resources that's used, and some of those grants were made often in contrast to bad evaluation results and performance results that the government knew about. So you have to worry about the fact that is government incentivizing innovation, or is it becoming the tool that you measure innovation by in terms of how much money they're able to get? So I've raised a little bit about the conflict of interest question here. I think it raises questions of accountability. Now, I'm a big nonprofit guy. I have to confess, I like nonprofits. I've been around nonprofits for it's 69. So I've been doing a lot of work with nonprofits. What strikes me as distinctive about nonprofits is that, the market is no guarantor of accountability, Nonprofits aren't guaranteed accountability either by a long shot, but at least there's some elements of disclosure and accountability written into law and regulations. For many of the privatizing or private entrepreneurs, I'm not sure we have very good mechanisms to make sure that they are accountable for what they are doing. For example, in your book, you mentioned the L3Cs, the low profit limited liability corporations, and the B corporations, and I think you referenced the idea that these are being regulated at the state level. Well, I've tracked all the laws on the L3Cs. They're so vague about what an L3C is and what is low profit. How would I even know what low profit is in these laws? And I've talked to AGs and charity officials. They don't even know where the regulation would occur of these entities because they're hybrid, so they're not here, they're not there, they have charitable dynamics, and so forth. So there's a real question about whether or not these hybrid entities, some of them actually former nonprofits that have converted to this quasi, whatever it is, structure, are no longer accountable, no longer providing disclosure, and are not really being regulated. So I have a problem with that. This raises a problem for the nonprofit sector. Let's make sure that we're clear about this. Nonprofits are no great gems. When it comes to some of this stuff, they have a huge challenge. They have a huge challenge in this whole conversation because with the growth of hybrids, with the growth of social enterprise, they've done a very poor job in articulating what nonprofits do and what the particular distinction is of nonprofits and saying, here's the unique role that we play in society, so that they are losing a lot of the game. I think in many ways you listen to foundations who now say they are sector agnostic, which is the term, meaning that any solution they receive from nonprofit, for-profit, government is sort of all equivalent. The issue is they'll fund the solution, and then there's no preference to or leaning toward nonprofits as the sponsors of that is a huge challenge to the nonprofit sector to understand some of what you're saying about innovation and the need for innovation in the sector if it wants to understand how it's going to compete. I've raised the question about some of the money issue, and I don't want to go too long on that. Let me raise one point that I think does get us very clearly into some public policy issues, which is that many of the examples in the book, and many examples we could have raised outside, aren't non-ideological, even though innovation, of course, is something that crosses all sectors. Many times in the book, you would refer to something and say, well, we can't get into that here, such as the education reform issue and other issues where the way innovation, and again, I'll stay with innovation as opposed to entrepreneurship, the way innovation is applied often leads to certain kinds of political outcomes that have political connotations. I mean, they lead to, many people would say they're privatizing and leaning toward a private sector model of public education. So there's a political dynamic that is the outcome of this that one has to be attentive to in public policy. It's certainly related to what the president is doing with I-3 and the race to the top and promised neighborhoods. All of them have those dynamics. Two last points. And this, again, goes to what government is incentivizing. I was at the White House last week where the president gave out the citizen medals for people who have done extraordinary things in our society. And I was struck by the fact, and this was a program, by the way, that was coordinated by the Corporation for National and Community Service, that every person that got one of those awards, and I'm holding aside the special awards that were heartbreaking for the families of Newtown, but leaving that aside, the other citizen awards, everyone went to a person that had created an organization. So that it was all focused on a person rather than a system, a person rather than a network, a person who created rather than someone who simply happened to work in an organization. It's a person-centric kind of approach, and I don't think you were trying to push that, but I think a lot of social entrepreneurship leads you to this idea of let's go find the next Bill Drayton, let's go find the next Muhammad Yunus, let's go find the next Steve Jobs, as opposed to saying how do we create through public policy systems and networks that tap communities for their creativity and innovation at the lowest levels and actually seep that innovation up, that it bubbles up as opposed to tries to percolate down. I think that's a critical issue. I'd like to see us start talking about innovative entities. Diana, you were talking about the ecosystem, but even there, I heard you say, well, we look for social entrepreneurs. I'd like to say we look for innovative networks, innovative systems, innovative cultures, which reflect where innovation in our society comes from. And to me, that's critical. And then finally, I'd like to raise the question then of what government actually does. And that is, if you look at the incentivizing for government, from government for innovation or for social entrepreneurship, I have some real problems with this. If you notice that states have been falling all over each other to create L3C laws. I mean, it's the fastest thing growing that you think of. And why is it? Because it requires no money. You get to basically say, let's create an L3C, and hopefully that will show our serious response to the economic problems of our state, as opposed to saying, wait a minute, we need some real capital to advance a particular kind of issue. And in fact, I've heard many social entrepreneurs say in many settings, and self-identified social entrepreneurs, say in many settings, if government supports social, or if social entrepreneurs proceed, government will save money, that this will be a reduction of government outlays as a result of entrepreneurship. I think that's a tricky road to follow. Now, Howard and I have very different perspectives on this one, but I think there's a real issue of government using a lot of this language to minimize and withdraw from what might be an appropriate government response to some of the social problems. If you think of the social impact bond in the Obama budget, what was it, $100 million? Social Innovation Fund was initially $50 million. In my world, that's called bupkis. I mean, that's not real money. So that if we're talking about doing something significant, we have to be thinking about how government sees what's an appropriate level of support, as opposed to looking at this dynamic to say, this is a way how we can get out of it quickly, or get out of it cheaply, or get out of it in a way where the money often flows not necessarily to communities or the social entrepreneurs, but to intermediaries that suddenly pop up and become entrepreneurial and social, like J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs, huge new social beneficiaries. Let me add one last point, but only because you raised it, which is that you talked about the measurement issue. And I worry terribly about measurement. I think we're going to have real problems with that. My great example is from Seedco in New York, which was a great intermediary promoter of social innovation. And I'm sure Howard knows this one as well, where under the Bloomberg administration, they had a workforce job placement program where they got compensated for all their creative work in placing people, and they fudged the numbers in order to make the placements go. The Bloomberg administration, with its concern for innovation, never checked them and never expressed any desire to check. When it was revealed that they were fudging the numbers, the Bloomberg administration had to be reluctly dragged to the table to deal with this, and they all drove out the poor whistleblower who's now in Seattle in order to start a new life. So I worry about the fact that in doing evaluations, one of the easiest things to do is to fudge your data or to fudge the evaluations, because in reality, with most social problems, evaluations lead you to inconclusive results, not huge wins. So those are my concerns, but the book is wonderful. It raises so much discussion. I hope we have a good discussion here.
Great. Well, thank you very much, panelists. Yes, let's give them a hand. I think one of the things that becomes clear, and especially in Howard's and Rick's comment on your book, and I should say, you may now say whatever you wish in response, but let me see if I can kind of frame what I heard to be their sort of the big question they had for you, and that is this role of government and the role of public policy in this area. Clearly, in your book, you wanted to carry us, and Diana as well, in her work at Ashoka, you both suggest that we're moving past this phase in social entrepreneurship in which the emphasis is on the unique individual, right? And moving on to another state, and in Georgia's account, that sort of points us toward government, but both Rick and Howard in various ways have suggested problems with that move toward government. Can you address that a bit more directly, both of you, both and or either of you?
Oh, go ahead. I totally agree with Howard at the point, to your point about good ideas spread and don't need government. I mean, if ideas are good enough and to spread and are solving the problems that need to be solved, people are going to take those ideas and adapt them locally, and that's where innovation happens. In Ashoka's world, it was precisely that idea that big problems need to be solved by individuals in the country in which or the city or the neighborhood in which the problem exists. And the spread of those ideas will necessarily require innovation as they're spread to be relevant locally in a new location. In terms of role of government, government-led social entrepreneurship is, for me, a bit of an oxymoron, in part because of the definitions that I carry for social entrepreneurship. Government can't exhibit. Government has to take minimum risk with taxpayer dollars. There's a level of accountability. To move quickly, to adapt based on what you're learning is key critical criteria for entrepreneurship that, again, that government has a challenge to adapt quickly. That said, government's role in helping the ecosystem develop so that more solutions surface and more solutions are visible and more solutions to problems can be spread, I think is exactly a critical role for social entrepreneurship. I think the Social Innovation Fund is one experiment in that regard, and that there is a role for government to leverage private dollars or foundation dollars to help do that, as the Social Innovation Fund did. And yeah, so that government's role in lowering the barriers of entry for people to start their businesses, social business or social entrepreneurship, again, for job creation is an important role.
And Georgia, first of all, maybe, am I getting it wrong? Am I overstating the extent in which, in your book, you're describing a kind of a shift from this much more individualistic and government-suspicious origin of social entrepreneurship to a future, a present and a future in which it is, in fact, much more sort of government-involved and...
So I think what I certainly describe a shift, I think that has evolved a little bit from a fiercely individual notion of sort of the lone entrepreneur to what Ashoka and others have described as a more collective or collaborative and often community-based approach. I mean, this is where I think the point about it being sort of bipartisan, or not bipartisan, but sort of not political, right? I mean, sort of whether you're the Tea Party or whether you're sort of progressives working at the grassroots level, I think that there is this notion that this fierce laser-like focus on an individual and an individual superstar really is not helpful in thinking about collective. So I do think that there's and then how we measure that becomes very complicated, right? It's much easier to evaluate a single person, a single organization, harder to evaluate community or collective efforts. I think that's true. And in terms of the government, I mean, I sort of put the public sector piece last in the book, not because I think there's this inevitable move towards federal top-down industrial policy, but I do think, and this is to answer, I do think that the way I thought about the role of government is exactly in this sort of, in two ways actually. So I'd say first on the capital side, or sort of who's funding these. I agree. I mean, Howard made the point. Others have made the point that effectively the nonprofit sector is sort of a network government now, right? I mean, that many social services are effectively government funded or partially funded and nonprofit sector delivered, and that's an arrangement that we've seen grow over 25 years. But I'd be a little bit concerned that if we pull back, right? I mean, we'll see on Friday what happens. If you pull back all of that government funding, I am not sure that locally or nationally there is the private philanthropic support for the safety net beyond Medicare, Social Security, beyond what Howard might think are sort of basic entitlements. I think we have a larger network of social supports that rely on government funding, whether they're nonprofit delivered or even in some cases private company delivered. So that there's the capital piece. I think the way I understood, or what I was hoping to do, was think about social entrepreneurship as largely a larger discussion about entrepreneurship and what the government can do and what the government has actually long done. I mean, LISC has been at this for, there are many, right, this conversation about how new innovation is an interesting question. But ways in which the government can use things like tax credits, can use things like regulation, but can also think about how to bring private sector actors, their capital, their resources, their energy. And there's a reason that the Small Business Association is now focusing on all kinds of incentives for startup activity, social entrepreneurship or otherwise, because that's where a lot of new job creation takes place. And so I think that thinking about government as again, this is very jargony, but as sort of a catalyst rather than, it's not picking winners so much as saying, right, I mean, government recognized 20, 30 years ago that we didn't have enough capital for startups of any kind, venture capital, private equity, right, and we put all kinds, we looked at ERISA, we looked at tax incentives, right, we only tax capital gains at a very low rate in order to encourage those types of credit and capital to flow. And I guess as I sort of thought about social entrepreneurship, it was linking it up with that type of role of government. I mean, I can talk more, but I think, anyway, I'll leave it there. I'll reopen it up, but I had in mind, and I addressed the L3Cs and the B corporations and all of those because I think they're interesting. And I know this is being recorded, so I should be careful. I don't think that those are these widespread solutions to anything, really. I mean, I think that they're interesting. But they're happening at a very small scale in a handful of states. I think there's excitement and enthusiasm. Why I think they're interesting, because I do think they raise this larger question of what we mean by fiduciary responsibility. So the reason they exist is to protect companies and to protect managers and early investors from sort of shareholder revolt if you're purchased or acquired or you go public. But I do think that it's an interesting question about allowing private sector companies to take a longer term view of their role in the products they create or the services they create in a way that we don't always afford them now. So I can get more into that discussion. Yeah. But I don't think, I am not a fan of sort of top-down legislation of the way entrepreneurship is supposed to work and picking winners. That's not how I envision the public policy.
Howard, Georgia makes an historically sound point, which is, government has been steering the private sector in all sorts of ways over the years. Can you distinguish the kinds of interventions, by government in the private sector that you regard as legitimate and necessary, and what you seem to be suggesting is not necessarily legitimate and necessary? I mean, you're clearly in this area of entrepreneurship, you have serious reservations about government involvement. Why that? What is it about this particular field that should protect it from government involvement?
I think the cultures of Diana put it very well. I think the government is risk averse, mm-hmm. and the fiduciary responsibility of nonprofits. When you have a government contract, your whole incentive structure changes, appropriately so. If you're entrusted with the public's money, you've got to show that you're fulfilling the terms of the contract. The emphasis becomes much more inevitably on process and outputs and numbers served. That's what you traffic in when you have a government contract. And so I worry that even though entities like the Social Innovation Fund want to sound different, that it's an extension inevitably of that sensibility, which will be at odds with the more kind of creative culture that we need to see hatch in the nonprofit world.
Yeah, and Rick, picking up on an important point you made, which was the the nonprofit sector is somehow losing its essence in the course of emphasis on social entrepreneurship in this new way, which does seem to be sector agnostic in many ways. I mean, right? I mean, we're talking about, Diana was talking about, Georgia was talking about a kind of a free flow across the sectors, right? And there isn't any clearly demarcated boundaries between the sectors any longer. Why? What's your beef with that? I mean, you're kind of swimming against a huge tide, right, in the field of nonprofits and foundations. What is this purity in the nonprofit sector, or this essential character that you're trying to preserve, and what's wrong with this effort to kind of bring the good things from these other sectors into the mix?
Well, purity would be something people don't ascribe to me at all.
Yeah.
I think the issue is that we have 1 million 501c3 public charities in this country. The question is, what is it that distinguishes a 501c3 from government, which is it's a problem raised when nonprofits become essentially arms of government and distributing government programs. And what is it that distinguishes a 501c3 from business when they start operating so much like business that you can't distinguish them? So there's a real question here as to what is a 501c3 public charity. Why does it exist? What is it about a public charity that merits the tax benefit that it gets? What is it that merits the tax exemption when it owns property in a municipality? I heard, I've been looking at the pilots in many cities, and the municipal officials say, well, gee, if a for-profit does things that are charitable, what's the distinction between giving a nonprofit a tax exemption and a for-profit a tax exemption? So there's a real question as to what a nonprofit does. What's the essence of a nonprofit that distinguishes it from the other sectors? And I think the distinction actually is a very healthy distinction. If it weren't, then they would say, let's either become businesses all completely, or let's become complete arms of government. And I think there's something distinctive and different. I don't think, though, nonprofits have engaged that well, and I don't think they've drawn well necessarily on the innovations in technique and management, and the incorporation of creativity. It could be, Howard saying it may be that there's in a way, a stultifying effect of government contracting on nonprofits because of the fact that they have to manage to the contract as opposed to manage to creative goods. I think in many cases, since I was also on the government side for some years, many government officials would love to see nonprofits coming up with better ideas and saying, here are better ways of doing what you're supposed to be doing, and they'd be open to seeing those changes occur. So the question becomes how nonprofits learn from and incorporate innovation in their work and convey that to the other sectors that they work with as partners, but they are still different than them.
Yeah, good. All right. Let's, if we may, turn to our audience and see if we have any. Mark, I promised that I would give you Mark Schmidt from the Roosevelt Institute.
We talked a lot about role of government. We didn't really talk about politics. And it seems to me I heard Howard articulating kind of a theory of politics, and that the kinds of social entrepreneurs he's encouraging, really build into a tradition of government should do less. But I don't know what the theory of politics is for the non-Howard social entrepreneurship world, and if there is an adequate one. And a framing like innovator or entrepreneur kind of is an it kind of says, well, the reason these things aren't being done is because there hasn't been enough innovation, rather than, for example, there's a conflict and that these things aren't happening. Some areas, I do think things like Teach for America obviously fit very directly into a political, what's emerging as a very significant political movement. But I wonder to the degree that the other dimensions of social entrepreneurship have that capacity to say, when we think something works, we actually can get into the fight about making sure that it is kind of picked up. And the other dimension of that, of course, is a lot of individuals, particularly younger individuals. It's a lot more attractive to be a social entrepreneur or to be a TFA teacher than it is to, say, be an advocate for more education funding or even for other kinds of changes in the schools, even though there's an implicit politics in some of that. So I wonder if you could kind of address the political theory of social entrepreneurship.
Political theory of social entrepreneurship. Excellent.
I won't promise that, but from our experience with over 3,000 social entrepreneurs over 30 years, it's very clear that one of the ways for an idea to spread is that your idea becomes part of public policy. And that doesn't necessarily mean funding will flow, but that that public policy is a delivery system for ideas that work. Ideally, that would be a wonderful case. And I've seen a hesitancy among folks in our network to become part of the political fray because people come into office and they come out of office. And if they're aligned politically and that party is out of office or out of fashion, then what happens to the idea? If the idea is really about social good and social impact, you want that idea to stick, and being part of the political debate and political fray can put that idea spreading at risk. So that said, one of the key ways that idea spread happens for many social entrepreneurs is that it becomes embedded in political policy. That will work best if it's not part of the political fray. There's a great article by Richard Proskier which looks at how social entrepreneurs, because of how they work in terms of building social capital, affect change not through conflict, not through political conflict, but through building social capital, are able to move the ball, the issue, in a longer lasting, non-confrontational political way.
Well, you're quite right, Mark, that I'm positing social entrepreneurship as kind of a parallel universe to the welfare state to a certain extent. I'll quite be frank about that. But I would also distinguish between social entrepreneurs who are providing direct services to people in need in some way and policy advocates who are looking to have public policy change. And I don't think it's useful to lump them all together that way. I think they're doing different things. When you have clients and people who come in through the door and you've got to deal with their individual problems, that's really different than, say, even a really effective group like Mothers Against Drug Driving. The people who started Mothers Against Drug Driving changed the world. They changed laws in probably every state about what the legal blood alcohol limit is, right? Were they social entrepreneurs, or are they policy advocates? I think it's more useful to think of them as policy advocates, just so we don't lump everything under this term social entrepreneurship, so it means nothing at all.
I wouldn't lump everything under social entrepreneurship, but the sector and the organizations are much more complex and they're multifaceted. So it's very hard to identify where the boundary lines are. And I was very glad to see in your book you talked about advocacy, and it was good. We don't see that much in discussions of social enterprise, but I do think we have to understand that there is a political dynamic to much of what the market does in incentivizing particular kinds of innovation. I mean, I have to say that the old Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie model of nonprofit activities where they would come up with an idea and government would replicate it has been going on for a long time. That's what nonprofits have been doing for many years. That's why we had the war on poverty and many other things. That was tested in the nonprofit sector. I think, though, many of those tests were very much public sector-oriented tests, that the programs that were being demonstrated, Gray Areas Project leading to the war on poverty, was to get government to do more. Many of the innovations and the entrepreneurship that I see occurring is a privatizing entrepreneurship, so that the politics of this is often models that lead you to non-public solutions to what used to be public venues. And the question becomes, is that good or bad? Do you agree or disagree? But I think that is a political dimension here that can't be ignored. So when TFA or cities, when TFA is connected to other organizations that are advocacy organizations like Students First and others, there's a political dynamic that can't be ignored in terms of where the leaning goes.
So that's interesting. You interpret social entrepreneurship in the non-Howard way as still somewhat oriented toward privatizing. Interesting.
Howard and I often agree on things. We just come at them completely differently.
Well, you don't want to hollow out government, and I'm more open to.
Exactly. Yes. Well, that's and I was going to say not to point the way toward George's answer, but I read her book with some exceptions like TFA. By and large, these are groups who are interested, I thought, in expanding the role of government in some fashion or another, shaping government policy so that it has a larger role in public life. Am I wrong about that?
No, well, I think in the handful of nonprofit examples that I had looked at, actually, to Mark's point about advocacy, I think there have been a number of organizations actually, and Ashoka I think is actually unique in this respect, in not sort of co-opting large sort of government sums and essentially trying to earmark itself and becoming an extension of government. It's rather unique, I think, at this point in the nonprofit sector for maintaining a distinct relationship. I think that I do think that there's a class of organizations, the City Years and the Teach for Americas of the world, who began life, I think, not really interested in the public sector, not really interested in public policy, but recognized actually, and I do think it's important to distinguish between organizations that are purely advocacy organizations and organizations that do direct service, but there are organizations that do both, and I think have succeeded in doing both, recognizing that the best way they're going to achieve their ends, whether it's education reform, right, whether it's sort of a national service platform, you name it, sort of environmental change in legislation. I mean, organizations like Environmental Defense Fund, they're doing direct programming, but they also realize that public policy has huge reach and those dollars are critical. Then the question is, are they now just entrepreneurial because they're very good at essentially getting themselves earmarked, or are they continuing to do interesting work? I mean, Mark wrote a great article on sort of how you think about advocacy and measure it, because that also becomes tricky. But there are many who do the cost-benefit analysis and say, here's our budget. Maybe we're really better off investing most of that in advocacy and trying to unlock a lot of government dollar, right? That's the healthcare reform.
Right. Yeah. Yes, please, right down front here.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm a political economy blogger, and I enjoyed each of your comments. Just a question to Ms. Wells and to Rick as well. Regarding taking that individual challenge, or the social entrepreneur as the individual, and making that more of like a culture, or making it more of an ecosystem, I was excited to see that one of the Ashoka fellows, I think Ehab Abu in Egypt, took this philosophy and came up with something called the Practitioner's Guide for Social Entrepreneurs in Egypt and the Arab world. I'm not sure how Ashoka has tracked that or how they feel about it, but I'm curious to see, is this one of the ways, by having one of the somebody taking this idea and making it into a course to teach not like a group of activists, but just people who are still trying to create not just a career, but a mission after they complete university. Is this one way? And if not, what are the ways? I know the United Kingdom already has a couple of institutes that focus specifically on social entrepreneurship and divorce it from the advocacy process. But maybe it's because of their political culture there. I don't know. So just some thoughts on that.
This case, I know a little bit, I don't know completely, but is analogous to what we're seeing on university campuses here today. Like, it's quite clear that the world is changing. Jobs that young people are going to have when they come out of college don't yet exist as they're entering college, the rate of change. And so the role of universities and education is changing. How do you equip young people to be ready for this world of change? And sharing from people, as you mentioned, how to ready young people for that world, and helping them practice the skills that are necessary for living in that kind of world and for practicing change making is a key piece. So we are seeing yes, in Egypt, but also in all over campuses in the United States and other parts of the world, a hunger from students and from universities who are eager to learn about how to foster skills around change making, and being social entrepreneurs.
Well, turn it into a public policy question, because I still think that that's the exciting part of George's book, it was the end, is to me it's where it all leads and adds up to. If the idea is to build networks of people and build cultures of people that are engaged in innovation and entrepreneurship, what do you then do? And I would think that we have some opportunities to rethink public policy in this country as to how we incentivize that. For example, some might have said, if you look back at the history of the Social Innovation Fund, given the fact that I don't think it did very much to create innovation, that maybe that would have been a better expenditure of money had it incentivized and funded networks for the exchange of information, so it would make that more robust in terms of the dialogue among innovators, so they can learn from Cincinnati Works and other groups that way.
Can you cut a ribbon on a network of innovation?
Now, the problem of cutting ribbons is a really critical issue in public policy, and I agree, and that's why they tend to go toward not just funding projects, but funding projects that are safe as opposed to risky, and that's the other part of the cutting ribbon piece. The second part, though, is who are we talking about trying to help become entrepreneurs and innovators? When much of this movement started back in the 90s, it was a pretty elite little group of people. I mean, one of the organizations that used to support these was limited to Ivy League students, and then it opened up and included Stanford. So I mean, that was a big movement toward egalitarianism. I mean, when I hear Diana talk about students that are hungry for this, half of America's students go to community colleges, which are community based, and those young people, actually, they're a little bit older than the usual profile of most students, and they also often look different than this panel does in terms of racial and ethnic makeup, are very hungry for the ability to be and express entrepreneurship as well. Yet we often don't have anything that taps that network of 6 or 7 or 8 million students that could be incentivized to be innovators. So I think we should be thinking about how do you build those networks through public policy, how do you provide support, and how do you reach out to people that don't typically make it into the elite discussions of entrepreneurship.
It would be interesting to hear from the panel a bit more about this notion of, I mean, there is a certain sort of Ivy League characteristic to certainly the early entrepreneurs. I mean, these were folks of a certain class orientation and so forth. And the first organizations came out of that whole approach. Rick is suggesting there might be, a more democratized approach than Diana. I think you were getting at some of that as well. Georgia? Are you ready for some of that as well, or I mean, what's?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely, and I think that this is why, in thinking about a very different model that's not focused on sort of these elite, very fancy entrepreneurs, but rather really community level work, also community. I'm trying very hard to avoid jargon because it's sort of a meta conversation, but the solutions, identifying the problems and then coming up with the solutions to the problems at a very local level. And one thing we haven't talked about, I'm loath to suggest that technology is the solution to this, and I'm actually just reading this, what is it, the problem with technological solutionism, the new click here, save everything, right? I'm cognizant of the fact that we can't just say technology in the cell phone example that Howard used, which I love, is going to solve all these problems. However, I do think that what technology, but also has allowed for a kind of community engagement, for people to say, we're going to do community level budgeting. We're going to weigh in on the programs, the problems that are where trash is a problem in our and letting people actually weigh in and communicate not just with their governments, but with each other at a very local level to say, here are the problems, and also maybe we can come up with some of the solutions. Now, I do think that government has a role perhaps in setting up some of the architecture for that, and or perhaps some of the funding for the architecture for that, right? I mean, the cell phone example is interesting, kind of occurred sui generis, but there's a lot of connectivity and technology piece that actually requires some kind of infrastructure investment, to describe it, that is a public good that needs to be provided by government. But I absolutely think that the more interesting and the true innovation, not this sort of evidence-based proven stuff, is going to occur at a much more local level.
Yes, please. I'm sorry, sure, let me, and then next one. Next question.
Hi, my name is Mara Mayer, and I'm here representing Encore.org, which some of you may know in its previous incarnation as Civic Ventures. And as you talk about sort of this category of people, I just want to point out that there's another category of people who are very much involved in entrepreneurship and trying to change their communities in the larger world, and that is people who are 60 and over. I just wanted to point out that there's a real movement there, and it's an important one. And you may know that Encore.org essentially oversees the Purpose Prize, which honors people 60 and over for doing wonderful things in their communities. And the deadline for the next submission is April 4th. So if you know someone, we're building a network, and we invite you to join it. Thank you.
Yeah, don't forget us people over 60 now, come on.
I have no personal comment on that. I would just say that I actually link that to the discussion about Ivy League-led social entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
And there's just a great Tocquevillian tradition of people in America starting interesting organizations all over the country, and even if they weren't evaluated by consulting firms and started with elaborate business plans. And going through business plan competitions, they can still be really, really good.
Yeah, and it has to be said instantly about this, the contributions of folks over 60 and approaching 65. There have been many waves of technological and social change that have subtracted steadily from the energy of civil society, as we know. Women in the workplace, the rise of television, so forth and so on, all of these have been sort of massive demographic subtractions from the energies devoted to purely voluntary associations and civil society. But this one, as more of us cross that 60-year mark, it's one of the first demographic trends that's actually going to be a serious addition, I think, to the energies of civil society. For the first time, we're going to have a lot of very capable people who have time for this sort of thing. I promised this lady right here that she would get the next question, and here comes the microphone. Please identify yourself and affiliation.
I'm Lois Tett, president and founder of MAWA, which is Majority and Women-Owned Businesses. I believe, a social entrepreneur, and I will point you to two others. There's one in California that was anointed by Clinton for his innovative programs for high school students, which at that time he let them use it for $25 to get into it. Those youth were making six figures after shortly enrolling in his program. I think that's a social entrepreneur. I'm not sure. Another one right now that is doing something is Comcast. Comcast has a program called Internet Essentials, which the qualifications are to be a student enrolled in school and on the free lunch program. They're trying to spread the word out wide. They will give them the computer, or help them get the computer, and pay $10 a month for the internet. But the only hangback is they cannot be a customer of Comcast. If they are, then they have to wait 6 months, and I think that may shoot it in the foot because a lot of those kids have Comcast. So, and finding money, following the money, broadband, been talked about for weeks in our neighborhoods. Comcast has found a way to package this. I don't know that government is involved. Comcast got enough by themselves, you know that. Time Warner had a program looking for IT youth in high school getting ready to graduate. Sent somebody up there. He got connected, and he's in the community teaching and going on with his business. We have to find a way to connect them ourselves. We cannot rely on government. It'll mess it up. Because it's too much paperwork, it takes too long.
Singing Howard's song, I suspect. How about that?
But are there opportunities, and I'm going to go back to something that I think Georgia touched on as well, for innovation in governance, in the way government actually addresses problems, so that when this woman says, oh, it's too much paperwork, and listen, and the reason we go toward private sector models is because the private sector can be faster and more flexible, or Howard would say, private sector won't be as risk averse as government. Are there innovations that you're seeing as entrepreneurship in the way government functions as a governmental entity that takes it more toward a creative, flexible, effective posture without losing the fact that it's government serving people who need?
Rises.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a huge topic, and I think when I started looking at social innovation in the public sector and what exactly that meant, and whether the stuff the Obama administration was doing with open gov and open innovation, open government, was this, and I tried to understand what is this? Is this innovation funds, or is this really kind of reinventing government redux? And I think it's a little bit of both. I do think that this notion that and the more interesting, I actually think the more interesting examples are taking place at sort of local government, and that's why I use some of the. I live in New York City, so I didn't have to travel too far.
The group budgeting thing, for
right,
example.
but exactly. So, but there are many interesting examples beyond the Bloomberg administration. But I do think at the neighborhood and the local level, and some of it's technology enabled, and some of it's just not. I mean, some of it is just kind of citizens reclaiming their role in seeing themselves as citizens beyond voting. So that might be in the budgetary process. That might be engagement with the schools and some of the education reform, but happening at a pretty local level. I do think, and some of it's jargon, but some of the examples that I did like the Obama administration was at least thinking through is trying to bring entrepreneurs into government. So someone made the point earlier that sort of these young, youthful idealists from across the political spectrum may go into the nonprofit sector, are keen to go into social enterprise or the private sector, but who is bringing talented young people in a deliberate, conscious way into government, sort of with an entrepreneurial orientation? And I think we are seeing some of that, but I think it's still not sufficiently sort of consumer-oriented or consumer-facing or whatever consumer.
Ruth, yes, sorry. Microphone is on its way. Speaking of social entrepreneurs, Ruth Lubitsch.
The lady has gone home, but I'm 86 years old.
Right, yes.
And running a project out in Ward 5 and showing the world that we can reduce the negative outcomes of poor African American people as it pertains to maternal and child health and early childhood education. I am a nurse midwife. I wanted to point out the organization that I ran for 25 years in New York had as its first executive Frances Perkins. And I wonder if you've thought about what the government's efforts at New Deal, how many of those came from Frances, who was a social worker, because there is a book out about her which says that they were her ideas and she just convinced Franklin to do them. So, but I wanted to ask a question, because when you innovate in a marketplace and you get opposition in that marketplace, to whom can you turn except government? Because nurse midwives for many, many years have had opposition from the marketplace, if you will. And we struggle with that all the time, and I don't know where else to go but to government.
Sort of raises that question of financing on a larger scale, which is we've had other conversations about that, but what do you have to say about that? Is government the only place where we can go? Howard, I mean, I
thought that Ruth was raising a regulatory question, actually. That nurse midwives face opposition from doctors in terms of being able to, the scope of their activity. And that may actually be a licensing issue in which government has to play a different role and has to be convinced to play a different role. So I interpreted that as a question about licensing and regulation.
But the last part of her question, which is if you're ready to take a program to the next level, where do you go except to government, right? Where else can you make your pitch except for?
Say Medicaid over $2 billion. And yet, what do we have to do to get the help that we need in order to replicate this? There are now 280 birth centers in the country, and we have gotten some from a strong start, but it's still, it's a struggle.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think this takes us back to politics. I mean, I work with a nonprofit dental group in Alabama that has a model of dentistry which is actually costs less to deliver than government-assisted dentistry. They could actually say, well, these are techniques we could have government replicate, and there's resistance from the dental industry, which advocates with government, which protects the interests of dentists, so that there is always a political dimension to much of what we're doing, which is why I find the separation between groups as service deliverers and advocates to be a little bit problematic, because there's no way you can just be a service deliverer without being able to advocate as well for the model that you have and why government should be open to it.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, I got to get one more question in, and Georgia first, why don't you go ahead and...
No, I was sort of half smirking, but I think actually, this is where this sort of evidence-based discussion is useful. I mean, if you really, right, I was going to sort of joke that you really should, that this kind of maternal health question should hook up with the social impact bond folks, right? Because to the extent that there are sort of evidence-based proof of substantial savings, right, for these kind of interventions, I mean, this is exactly what some of this new social finance, whether it's coming out of the philanthropic sector or some combination of sort of government policy with philanthropic capital. I mean, that's the kind of stuff they want to fund. They're not, and this is true in a whole range of preventive services. I mean, I'm also half smirking about the dentistry stuff, because the greatest interest in the mobile dentistry and the Medicaid dentistry industry actually is coming out of the private equity industry, right? I mean, if there's proof that there are savings here.
It's not coming out of a dental establishment, is it?
No, that's right. But there are actually private actors who are willing to get involved.
Alan. Alan, this is Alan Abramson, George Mason, right? And he brought his class in social entrepreneurship along today. So for all of you academics watching over live stream, YouTube, whatever that is, you can do what Alan did and bring your class to these sessions if it happens to fit your syllabus that day. Alan.
Thanks for having us. Georgia, question for you. If you did believe there was a public policy role in terms of supporting social entrepreneurship, and you might think the social innovation funds might have been phase one, or the most recent phase, America Forward lobbied for a bunch of years and was able to get that. What do you see as the next phase in terms of a public policy agenda for a federal public policy agenda for social entrepreneurship?
So I guess, I mean, this is a little bit of a cheating answer, except that I like to situate it in a much larger discussion about private energies and private capital. And what I mean by that is, I sort of just briefly mentioned the social impact bond example, which is a very small, I mean, these are, a couple $1 million pilots that are going on, really only one now in the U.S. But I think at the other end of a similar spectrum, I think that there are things like infrastructure banks, right, where we're talking about billions of dollars in private sector capital that can be brought to bear on public purpose and sort of necessary public purpose needs and projects. And so I think to the extent that we are starting to think about, the question was raised about, is this really sort of social entrepreneurship, especially in the public sector context, about kind of doing more with less, and are we really just not talking about the fact that we've run out of resources and we need to bring in additional capital? And I think as much as we want to talk about innovation, in fact, what we're really talking about is that we have budgetary constraints, and we actually do need other sources of capital. And so to the extent that there is a public policy agenda that has to do with bringing in other sources of philanthropic capital, which is, I think, part of what the innovation funds try to do, or large-scale commercial capital to bear on, and that's different than privatization, but it's whether infrastructure investments are a good example, or small prevention programs. I think there are ways to do it that have to be very carefully crafted. I'm not a huge privatization advocate, sort of in a blanket sense, but I do think it's really unlocking major sources of capital. I mean, right, pension funds are trillions of dollars in pension funds. A small fraction of those that could be made already are. CalPERS, others are in sort of economically targeted investments in their own communities, which isn't necessarily about social enterprise, but it's about CalPERS putting $2 billion in California industries, California companies. And so I think just thinking about the broad sweep of capital that could be available and perhaps directed, nudged, however you want to describe it, a little bit more towards public purpose projects.
Why don't we use that question? In other words, next steps in this field of social entrepreneurship. What does the future hold? Very brief responses from the rest of the panelists, because we're just about out of time. If you would like, what's next? Where are we going? And including the public policy piece that Alan raised. If you don't want to talk about it, that's fine.
I predict some, we're already seeing little bits of this with the LC3 and other hybrid models, social impact bonds, that the difference between nonprofits and for-profits will are getting more fuzzy, will get more fuzzy. It would be a brave new world if corporations were defined by their social impact, but that may be more. There are some that are striving to do that, if that were more of the norm.
Howard, is that what you want? Corporations aiming at the more social purposes?
Yeah, obviously that worries me because I won't get in. I already said my piece on that.
Right.
But I think what I'd like to see is for philanthropists to try to make clear that there are some big goals. I think the reason that people look to government because they want to do big things, and they don't know any other way to do big things. And I think it's incumbent on those of us who think that government isn't working that well in doing those big things to come up with alternative approaches to convince the public that there are other ways to do those big things. And I think that if philanthropists were to band together, I tried to say this before, and say, here's a couple big projects, and we're looking for 100 people in 100 cities to take on these projects in whatever way you think is the best. But we know that if everybody learned English who doesn't know it now, they'd be better off. We know that if young and pregnant mothers had better nurse midwife care, they'd be better off than they were now. But I think that we have to have the philanthropic sector willing to send a signal that it's willing to commit to kind of these things without committing to one big organization that spreads across the country, because I don't think that'll be that much different than government.
Rick, last word.
I'd flip his position the other way. I'd say I wish philanthropy were listening to 100 people around the country with good ideas, innovative ideas to bring and to nurture up, because I often worry that people in foundations, once they walk through the door and enter the sacred office, they somehow think that God has put extra brains in their heads, and somehow we don't have quite as much. But I think on a public policy perspective, I would think that the key thing now is to build that infrastructure for the exchange of information and the sparking of networks for the kind of creative exchange that, Diane, I think you're talking about with democratization, because that's where we're missing huge swaths of America in these programs. I mean, much of America is not a participant in this whole dialogue that we're engaged in. Much of America is not a dialogue in much of anything, not a dialogue in much of anything, if you read Politico and other newspapers. So how do you take innovation through public policy and have it reach communities that need resources, that need innovation, and have innovative ideas to propose if they can get the attention? That's where we have to move in the building of that infrastructure.
Very good. Yep.
Just to build on that, I mean, we see innovation happen where two sectors that previously haven't been working together or haven't talked to each other are talking to each other. We see it at universities where professors of social entrepreneurship are seeing that, science and, healthcare and public policy, that across sectors, when the silos are broken down, more there, it sparks ideas because people who haven't been talking to each other previously are, and hopefully we will see that going forward.
Excellent. All right. Just one quick note. Our previous discussion was on social impact bonds. So if those of you have an interest in that particular aspect of this issue, that transcript is up on our website. So let's give the panelists a hand for a terrific conversation.